Hi. Welcome to the channel. We're ready to go here. I've got my whiteboard with my various scribbles of how to format this video, what to talk about. My name is Cameron. I am a student of psychology. I'm a grad student working on my thesis currently. And I also grew up independent fundamental Baptist. I've since left that religion. I now identify as an agnostic. And I've been researching kind of this process of deconstruction through YouTube, through academic sources. And one of the common themes that I found through all of this and through videos, personal accounts, is that after the deconstruction process is done, whether that means changing denominations, changing religions, or leaving religion altogether like I did, there's still this frustrating thing that happens, and that's it still bothers you. There's still pieces that upset you. There are still things that even 5, 10, 15 years removed from religion, it triggers you. Basically. So things like seeing religious tweets, seeing pastors talking about things that, or defending things that directly harmed you is incredibly painful. And the frustration is why I walked away from it. Why do these things still continue to happen? Why am I still upset by these things? Why do I still feel the need to define some of these things? And so over the course of reading through some academic studies, some books, there's a concept and a term that was coined by Dr. Darrell Van Tongeren out of Hope College in Michigan. He's a clinical psychologist and professor there. Is a term called religious residue. Now, religious residue has kind of a negative connotation to it. When I was teaching a class on deconstruction, the way that I kind of explained it was when you're deconstructing, you're essentially tearing down the foundation of who you are brick by brick, right? But some of those bricks still work, right? So some of those pieces still bring comfort. For me personally, it was some of the teachings of Jesus, right? Helping the poor and downtrodden, making the world a better place for everyone, regardless of where they came from, their background, what they've done. And so when I was reforming my foundation, I kept those bricks. I reused pieces of that foundation. And so what I wanted to do with this video essentially was kind of explain what religious residue is, what causes it, and what I've done personally to kind of manage it. And so from Dr. Van Tongeren, there is the definition that individuals that go through the deconstruction process may still retain religious or supernatural beliefs, or may still engage in spiritual practices, although they do not identify as religious. So there's two key components to religious residue. There is some form of maybe loosely held belief of a supernatural divine being, or there are still some sort of engagements with religious practice. The second piece is not identifying with a specific religion. So the term, spiritual but not religious. For me, that's being an agnostic, right? I wasn't quite ready to say there is no God and go the atheistic route, but I also didn't want to try and define who or what that God is. I was fine with leaving it as this ethereal being that I didn't really think about very much anymore. And so what religious practices are, and considering what religious residue is maybe you occasionally go to church like I do. Maybe you meditate, maybe you pray, in those moments of just distress, when I'm driving and angry and just crying out to God like I used to, I stop and I go, why am I doing this? I don't believe this anymore, but I did. And so religious residue is that, basically, that those lingering triggers, those lingering thoughts and behaviors that are frustrating, right? Because you want to be done with it. And so how does religious residue impact different people? Well, in a study done by Dr. McLaughlin from Georgia State University, there are what's called the religious duns, and those are people who were formerly religious, identified as religious individuals, and now are no longer identifying as religious individuals. So within the religious duns, there are two subcategories. There's what's called the still practicing dun and the discontinued dun. Now, the still practicing dun are those that still engage in spiritual practices, religious practices to some sort of an extent, right? So maybe you go to church on Christmas and Easter now. Maybe you still pray occasionally. Maybe you've left mainline Christianity, but maybe you practice Buddhism now. Maybe you got really into crystals or witchcraft or Wiccan things, which are very rewarding in their own, but still considered some form of spiritual or religious practice. Those individuals are what's called still practicing duns. That's what I am. It's what the majority of the people that I know are, even though they are the minority of religious duns. The second category is what's called discontinued duns. So the discontinued duns essentially left religion and never looked back. They had no interest in exploring other religions. They had no interest in trying to define anything religious or spiritual at that point. What does this mean for religious residue? Well, this is where I leave academic studies and speak from my own experience, as well as others in the religious dun community that I've talked with. It seems as though still practicing duns have a higher amount of religious residue compared to discontinued duns. And so that got me thinking, why? Why is that? Why is there a disparity in religious residue? And so in looking into religious trauma, religious PTSD, I kind of found a potential answer. Now this, again, is just my thoughts on it. I don't have studies or scientific backing on this. This is just from personal experience. But religious trauma seems to be the foundation for religious residue. Essentially, religious trauma is the source or the foundation, and the religious residue is the behaviors and thought patterns that result as a result of that trauma. And so when looking at religious trauma, the first thing we need to do is define it. What is religious trauma? So religious trauma is the pervasive psychological damage resulting from religious messages, beliefs, and experiences. So what does that mean? So essentially, religious trauma is a unique type of trauma, and this is where I'm getting back into the academic sources. There was a study done by Allison Downey out of the University of Illinois, and essentially she looked at what is religious trauma. And there is a clinical psychologist, Dr. Allison Stone, who wrote a book on what religious trauma is. She specializes in religious trauma. She's a clinical psychologist. And essentially there are key components of religious trauma. Religious trauma is essentially a slow boil of trauma. There's not necessarily a defining event that creates the trauma. It's rather a compounding effect of religious messaging, religious behaviors, as well as religious experiences. Now, that doesn't mean that there is not trauma from being in the church, whether it be physical abuse, sexual abuse, the trauma that comes from essentially being banished, ostracization, but that is compounded on top of the religious trauma. So religious trauma essentially is when you grow up in those ideals, you have essentially a combination of authoritarianism coupled with toxic theology in Christian contexts specifically. And so what does that mean? So essentially you're being told growing up, right, that anything bad that happens to you is a result of some sort of sin you've not publicly confessed and repented from, and therefore it's your fault for something bad happening to you. Or that you should be happy to be going through some sort of a difficult time, because this is God testing you. This is how you grow and become a better Christian, in my case, right? And so essentially over time, those ideas reinforce the idea that these things are normal. Abuse is normal. This is something to either celebrate or something to recognize as your own fault. And that's why there's such a culture of victim blaming within the church. Why there is very low reporting of abuse that happens in the church. And so the other piece of that is the binary of emotions are good and bad. Thoughts and actions are acceptable or unacceptable. Bad emotions cannot be acknowledged or managed. For example, the depression doesn't exist, or ADHD doesn't exist. The line of depression doesn't exist. It's just because you've distanced yourself from God. ADHD is a result of just bad parenting. And so when you start to internalize these things, it becomes a taboo thing to talk about. So when you're having maybe a depressive moment or depressive time, you push it down. You don't acknowledge it because it's not allowed. And so when this happens over the course of years, over the course of formative years in human development, from a human psychological development and a biological development, the body internalizes this. And with trauma, harm is not simply resolved by leaving, right? Trauma physically changes how your body functions. It changes the nervous system, how it interacts, and in some cases it can result in symptoms similar to post-traumatic stress disorder. Religious PTSD is a thing that occurs. And so one of the other components to religious trauma is shame. And so essentially you should be you are ashamed of having these feelings. You're ashamed of having these thoughts. You're ashamed of wanting to do these things. And so you're constantly in conflict with yourself. And when you leave, it helps, but you still have those underlying thought patterns that have now become unconscious. They're no longer conscious thoughts that you have. It becomes unconscious emotional turmoil. Like for me, whenever I would do something that would, traditionally be considered a sin in the church that I grew up in, I had what I later referred to as my Protestant guilt is flaring up. Don't worry about it. Like if I'd go to a bar and have a couple drinks with some friends, that guilt, that shame would pop up of, I shouldn't be doing this. This isn't correct. Even though everything that was happening was perfectly fine, well within the healthy boundaries. But because your understanding of what is acceptable and what is not are so skewed, it's hard, and it takes a long time to get those things back to essentially unlearn and relearn. And so when you have this religious trauma, coupled with the trauma of losing your identity, your sense of community, and your sense of meaning and belonging in the world, it's difficult. Those three essentially play on each other, right? So essentially, in one fell swoop, you lose 3 out of the 5 criteria on Maslow's hierarchy of needs of what makes a healthy individual. Basically, everything above basic survival needs, so eating, sleeping, and shelter, it's all gone. So everything that we value as human beings, our rational thought, our critical thought, that sense of belonging is gone. And you really don't have anyone that you can turn to because maybe you've lost friends and family in this transition. And so it's a difficult thing to go through. And that's where the religious residue piece comes into play, right? So while you're working through these underlying traumas that are difficult to work through, because a lot of them now are unconscious, you'll still have those behaviors, right? You'll still use some of the language that you used to. You'll still engage in some of those behaviors. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean those behaviors are bad. If you enjoy those behaviors, that's great. But for some of us, it's difficult, it's jarring, it's frustrating to realize, okay, it's been 6 years since I've left. Why am I still dealing with this? It's because of that compounding trauma, that loss of identity, the loss of community, and the loss of a sense of purpose in life. And so that brings me essentially to kind of the final point. What do you do about it? For me personally, I embraced it. I dove straight into it. I went to therapy. I really dug in and tried to understand the source of where these things are coming from, and change how I looked at things, so that while maybe the behaviors still persisted, I was more okay with them. Or when I would recognize the anxious thoughts that would arise from that religious residue or religious trauma, I could recognize it and take a break, take a step back, recognize this is not my fault. It's okay. This is not something that I have to bear accountability for. It's something that unfortunately I have to bear responsibility in managing, but it's not something that I am accountable for. The other thing that I did was I tried to find a new sense of meaning and purpose in life. I read every book I could get my hands on regarding other religions, other ways of thinking, different ways of finding meaning in a postmodern world, and coupled that with rebuilding my identity. And it led me to this path of going into psychology, wanting to become a therapist, wanting to research and more deeply understand what happened to me, first of all, how it impacted me, and what can I do about it from a clinical psychology standpoint. And not only did I want to do that for myself, but I wanted to take those ideas and share them broadly, help provide people with the tools that they need to get through this, to learn how to manage these things. And lastly, but perhaps most importantly, was finding a new sense of community. There are support groups out there for those of us who have left religion. One of the ones that I have used is a group called Recovering from Religion. They have a chat and helpline. Their website also offers a place to look for local groups if you want to go in person. They themselves also host weekly online meetings virtually to meet with other people who've gone through similar things and discuss these topics. And that has been so validating for the experiences that I went through, the experiences that I'm still going through, and the struggles that I face on a daily basis. And so those are the biggest things that I can recommend: is find a community, find some sort of a group somewhere, somehow. If you're a university student, maybe there is some sort of ex-religious group that talks about these things. If you're in a larger city, maybe there is a local group that's unaffiliated with anything that you can go to. If you're in a more rural area and you're still surrounded by all of that on a daily basis, maybe in the rural religious South, you have online spaces that can work for you until maybe you can get to an in-person space. And so I seek these out. It it has helped immensely. So that's really everything that I have on the concept of religious residue, what it is, why it happens, and my best guess as to what to do about it. I hope this video was helpful. It was something that I've been thinking about doing for quite a while, and while I've waited for my study to get approved, and then the inevitable lengthy portion of writing and getting data collection done, I wanted to at least put my ideas out there, because from the videos I've seen, we're hurting. We're in pain and we don't know where to go, and science doesn't really have an answer for us yet. And it's going to take a while. It's going to take a while. These science moves slowly for good reason. We want to make sure we get things right. But in the meantime, I wanted to put my voice out there. Join the people that already have put their voices out there. I want to keep making videos on these topics of the psychology of religion, of finding meaning, post-religion, different things like that. So I will put resources that I have found personally useful in the description. Please let me know if this has helped in the comments. Share your story, share what has helped. Maybe we can create our own little community here in this little corner of the internet. Yeah, thanks for watching. Again, I hope this helps, and I'll see y'all in the next video.